Hello, everybody. Welcome to meeting 7 of the Bytes Working Group. It is February 15th, 2023. My bad. How long has that been there? No, whatever. Anyways, cool. Thanks for joining, everybody. Today is going to be a fun one. We actually get to change up the sort of format for the meeting. We've been having presentations for our last 6 meetings, and then we had a kickoff at the beginning, which was not recorded. But today we are going to do a recap of the protocols that we've seen to date, try to understand and compare and contrast them, and start to just structure this as a group discussion to talk about next steps and what we might do from this. Because this was largely a request on behalf of the group as we've been working, saying, hey, it's time to step back and sort of take stock of where we're at. And Adine did some great work actually gathering up all of the different protocols. And we're going to go through this a little bit, but because this is really hard to read, I figured I would first take a stab at just summarizing some of the protocols that we've heard from so far that have actually presented in prior meetings in a quick review. And then we'll sort of open up the floor, and ideally that'll just become a nice starting point for conversations about what we're going to do next. So here's a copy paste of that fancy table, which some of it may have actually, Hannah, thank you for filling this out. It is not up to date on here, but just to get a quick look at this, there are some that are already implemented in here. So we've got BitSwap and GraphSync, the usual suspects. We've also got BitTorrent, WebSeed, and Git sort of listed out mainly as a sanity check and hey, these are real protocols that are in production. We also have CarMirror, KrakenSync, Stargate, Rapide. Rapide's a meta protocol, so I think it's debatable whether it goes on here. I've subbed it in. And then Curve HTTP, which I don't know enough about, and Manifetch, which I've gotten the details about just prior to this meeting. But I think the thing that is worth looking at from this is actually the headers, just understanding how we're comparing, contrasting some of these. The protocol type in particular, this is the most engineering approach to this is if we had to do an enumeration of different types of protocols. Some of these are request response, some of these do stream sessions, some of these are message oriented or multi-party. Are they stateful? State is in this case kind of fuzzy whether it's client side, server side, or both, because it's dependent on if it's just a client and server or if it's multi-peer. Can the server handle arbitrary data? I believe is that one. Can arbitrary data structures, right? So can we do lots of different types of requests? Incremental verification. Can we talk about data without downloading it? How much server side work, if any? What happens on the server side? Do we need to modify DAGs in any way to make this work, or do we need to do any external construction to make this work? What's our basic unit requests? I added a couple just before this, which is it designed to parallelize content, and what's its implementation status, which I think is a practical consideration. And so just to step through the ones that we've heard from that you can go back and watch videos about. We had 4 that were largely presented. Adine, I don't know if you want to say Manifest was presented in your meeting 3, but we can kind of.
I mean, it was also semi-presented by Hannah. It's a very stupid thing. You give me a graph descriptor, I give you the CIDs. There's no no magic. Magic is the client stuff. So.
Oh, okay. Well, then we'll leave that for the discussion section. But we have formally heard from CarMirror, KrakenSync, Stargate, and Rapide. And so those are 4 that you can actually go back and look at. And to briefly review those, I think it's worth the folks who put in the time to actually make a presentation on those. In CarMirror, I've taken my tongue-in-cheek stab at a pitch for each of these protocols. The pitch from CarMirror is the team at Fission needs a mechanism for doing better synchronization, right? And so this is avoiding redundant transfer with Bloom filters. They're trying to, the use case is a very general one. It's almost exactly like what Git runs into, where you have a lot of data already on both sides of the wire, and you just need to efficiently figure out what is missing so that you can do a set union across the wire. It has a working prototype. I have heard word from the Fission team that they have actually seen some signs of life from it in the last couple of days, which is very exciting. The protocol is formatted as request response. Important caveat on CarMirror, trusted context. You actually need to trust the peer on the other end for reasons that I will leave to the Fission presenters, but I understand that caveat. KrakenSync, the high level pitch for KrakenSync. Hey, let's do parallel fetch. Let's do it with bit fields. Let's take from BitTorrent, which did this properly so that we don't have to send so many CIDs over the wire. And the use case is really this, hey, we have lots of peers and they all have subgraphs of the graph that we're trying to assemble, right? So the idea that you may have a sparse population of the bits that are needed. The real magic of Kraken-Sync is applying the bit field trick to graphs, which requires a lot of massaging to make that function, to make it both deterministic and to deal with the common case where you actually cannot construct the graph because you can't complete the deterministic traversal of that graph to turn it into a field. It has a working prototype, is oriented around streams. Good stuff. Stargate, Hannah presented. TLDR HTTP is great. We should use it. And that's like, but I think the sort of thing that makes that radical and exciting is we should use it to like actually internally move data around. I think this, a lot of us have come from this world of, well, there's going to be the way that the P2P nodes talk, and then there's going to be the way that like gateway and external systems talk. And let's not do that. Let's just use HTTP because it's great. The idea, I think the general use case is like, hey, design a protocol that could replace BitSwap. It's there. It has a working prototype. It's request response. Good. Next and last, but okay, no, I don't want to move stuff around. Rapide was, I think the highest level of Rapide is just like, hey, why IPFS, why don't you do parallel fetching? This is ridiculous. You're a peer-to-peer protocol. You should be able to do parallelized fetching. The exciting things about Rapide are moving a lot of this complexity into the client side. So you actually have the client do a lot of the coordination of parallelized fetch. So that is easier to deploy in distributed systems when you just improve the client. You have to ask less about other nodes, which is really great. And it has a working prototype, and that working prototype has shown really great throughput numbers as Dropo demoed last week. It's also, its approach is also a meta protocol. So the idea here being that you could use different data transports to actually do the actual moving of stuff over the wire. And Rapide's sort of like contribution is we could make a meta structure that composes and supercharges that actual fetching, which I think is neat. Also makes it a little harder to slot into some of these things, but it's also, I think, really relevant to bring up as a protocol because to sort of, we're going to open this up to the floor and just talk about, hey, where do we go from next, and how do we ideally open some space for, that's not actually quite right, and how do these two concepts link together? But stuff that we've talked about in this working group that I think should help contextualize a discussion of where to take this. We should be also considering the adjacencies of the subsystems that moving bytes is part of, specifically content writing. There has been a whole content writing working group, and they're talking about how do we do this better and more efficiently. And one of the things that has really shown up as a recurring theme here with Kraken-Sync and Rapide in particular, but the carpool extension on CarMirror that was alluded to is this idea of, hey, we need to get into a situation where we are able to leverage the fact that we have multiple peers with equal or similar caches of the data that we want. And so this leveraging multi-peer availability to get better throughput is a really important aspect. But we've also seen from the measurements team that the IPFS network right now has this very significant bias to having a single provider for the vast majority of CIDs. And so I think that's not just a content writing conversation, but like also, is there something about the network about and understand there as we build these protocols that are trying to take advantage of a context where you really see the big pickups when multiple peers have the data, and you can get into a situation where you know that. And then the last, before I sort of like turns over, the other thing I'd ask us all to consider is when we convene this working group, we had some original use cases and requests that I went back and sort of pulled up just to sort of remind us of. In the beginning of this conversation, we said we should prioritize point-to-point for that very observation that the vast majority of CIDs in the IPFS network are provided by a single peer. We said HTTP support was a hard requirement, and that came from numerous parties in the ecosystem. The P2P support was implied by it must support HTTP. And so if we think about it, you just need to be able to support both in a lot of ways. We had numerous requests to minimize DAG interactions, so the actual amount that we touch the DAG. I think now that we've heard so many of these presentations, we are starting to refine that view in this group as asking the question of what state requirements do you have to place on a data transfer protocol? What do you have to calculate? Do you have to calculate it per request? How long do you have to hang on to it for? How does that overhead scale? Is it with the size of the graph? you have to touch the graph to calculate it, right? I think is the way that conversation has evolved. We said it needs a spec and a reference implementation to be considered for use. That's, I think we've seen a lot of working prototypes, and I think that's one of the things that I'm hoping to talk about today is like getting from working prototypes to actionable stuff. We've said it needs to be implementable in JavaScript. So far, aside from some bit twiddling stuff in Kraken Sync that I think we would still be fine with, everything we've seen has been implementable in JavaScript. And even that bit twiddling bits, I'm pretty sure we can get away with. It needs to be instrumented. In the beginning, we said it needed to be instrumented. With test ground, I think we can just abbreviate that to it needs to be instrumented in general so that we can see it. You can sort of hand wave that to say it needs to be measured. And it needs to have an open source license, and nobody here considers that controversial. So with that, I'm hoping today can be far more discussion oriented and just sort of like talk about where we go from here. We've seen some great protocols. We've seen working code. What do we do next? And so from there, I just want to open up the floor. Does anybody have any comments on that initial couple minute preamble? Lyle and Nadine?
I have like a very quick follow-up to this like summary table. There was like item about cars over HTTP, and we also discussed Rapide, but there's like a small detail which I feel is worth mentioning, that in both cases we don't talk about cars alone. There's always a way to fetch a single block, and that's how you remove IPLD dependency entirely. Whatever we do, there should always be a way for me to just fetch blocks I want. I will pay penalty of performance, maybe, or maybe I'll get better performance by running my own deserialization formats, right? But we always should have that escape hatch of having ability to fetch a specific blocks without having to get entire DAG. And that's how Rapide, even like Rapide, it fetches initial block. It does not go with car overhead for a single block requests. I believe that's how public gateways work today. You can fetch a single block. You can also fetch entire DAG as a car. So that's like a clarification more than a feedback.
Yeah. So as part of why I started trying to put the table together, and to try and like get people to help like figure out what the columns and whatever were here, is to be like, what are some of the properties of these protocols that like we care about, and what are some of the things that are like kind of who cares? And we all know they're kind of who cares, but I feel like it's important within this group to like say that out loud. So like, if I make a request response protocol and I do it over libp2p and like TCP and Mplex, or I do it over HTTP, like the amount of effort it would take if we built a new one of these or we versioned an existing one is like pretty minimal, right? So those are like, they're like gripes we have with everything that exists that are like fixable things, right? If you don't like the fact that the way the BitTorrent protocol works is using like, you know, UTP or something, you could do it, you could do similar things in other ways, right? Like that's not the interesting part. And then aside from that, there's a bunch of things that we kind of like gloss over as not interesting, but the fact that we don't have some group thought or progress or agreement on them causes problems. Like all of these things in which the unit of request is I want a graph instead of I want a block, which is most of them, because the I want to minimize graph interactions tends to look at I want a graph. How am I going to describe a graph? And everyone hates every way we describe a graph. So like, I think we need to make progress there. Like those sorts of like other things, I think I dumped for, yeah, I think I dumped for in the chat today when Brendan was asking me about the manifest stuff. And I was like, there's these other random things, the transport. How do I want to deal with headers? How big can they be? Can I shove Bloom filters on them and do whatever I want? Like, how do we describe graphs? do the graphs have to be totally ordered for everyone globally? Or can like each server do it its own way, as long as it's a valid traversal order? Right? Like how uniform does everything need to be? If I break up queries that are for graphs, do they also have to be resumable globally? Or do I just have to resume from the person I talk to? You know, how big are my units of cacheable thing? Those are like things that seem to apply like basically across all of these protocols. And maybe we all have very different opinions on them, or like maybe we don't, but just by the fact that they're all like implementation details that are not interesting, we don't end up like converging on a set of concepts. I think that was you.
Yeah, Hannah, are you up?
Or we can't hear you, Hannah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I would kind of want to throw a little bit of a curveball into a very non-technical aspect of this, which is that one question for me is like, can we develop a protocol to the point of production as a group that operates across a number of companies? It's an interesting challenge, and like I'm not sure like whether it's possible. And then the other part of that is that, to me, for this to work, so like part of the reason I think we have a bunch of prototypes and not a lot of like reference implementations and then even like we don't like the thing we haven't actually got to is the thing we said is currently our new deliverable, which is a test bed, or not a test bed, a set of test cases, right? For like all those things are things that emerge like when you have dedicated work time. Like I don't know how many people in this group have like dedicated work time. I don't. Like, you know, and I write lots of test, you know, beds for my production code, but like that's because I know I get 8 hours a day to do that. And, you know, when I'm like when I'm doing a couple extra free time hours, I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm going to spend my time writing really fancy, you know, test cases and metrics. And like, I mean, I know yes, it's very important. Totally. It is the most important thing, arguably, but it's just not the thing you want to work on in your free time, you know? So like, there's like I'm just interested in like, how do we get to where we're going? And without like our respective companies, well, some of you all have the ability, but not all, most of us don't, to like be like, I would like 20% of my time to do this.
Daniel, you seem like you have a thought percolating. If not, I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Hannah, for centering this on something practical. I think that what do you have a thought percolating? No, I don't know. I want to stop. You muted, Hannah. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. So this, I think this is the sort of core question of this group, right? And one of the things that's been exciting, or I like to sort of posit an approach that I think fits with what people are already doing. The things that are exciting to me are we have a lot of folks who have been highly motivated to run down an idea with code and have been sufficiently motivated to then turn around and present to this group their idea. And you know, in another world, you have an allegory for that, which is we wrote a white paper and we have an implementation and we have a sort of theory on why this thing is great and why more people should know about this research. All right. And so I'd like to argue that what we've been doing for the last couple of months is actually research. But what we now need to do is turn to that exact practical question that you have, Hannah, of like, okay, we know we've learned some things. How do we compose what we've learned into the best expression of something that would start to approach a spec, right? And the reason I want to inject the idea of a spec, or at least a document, is to force exactly what you're saying, Hannah, of like, how do you build a thing across numerous organizations? The answer is a spec. The only way that it works is a spec. You can't do this with like like where we've seen this we've run into this problem a bunch trying to write implementations based off of the pattern where you go implementation spec cross-compatible implementation. It's really hard because you always end up in this pattern where the cross-compatible, the original reference implementation gets way far ahead of the spec, and the motivation to maintain the spec is low. And if you can sort of get into this opportunity where, okay, no, if this group sits together, this is okay. Can we like compose some of these things together in a meaningful way? Maybe we can actually do the scary thing, which is group writing, and actually put together some of these concepts. Not all these concepts are going to make it onto the make it through the cutting floor, but can you actually write some composition protocols that says, hey, this is how we think we would replace bitswap as a group, and like do a recommendation? And maybe that's an abstract spec, maybe that's a super concrete spec that actually gets down to like wire status. But at that point, it's possible for anybody to go off and sort of try and write an implementation about that, or before you even write an implementation, critique the approach, right, and put that in a conversation with other existing stuff and research. And I know that may feel like pushing the like, hey, when can we have this further away? But in my mind, I think what we've actually been doing here is research is just the way that we do it. It tends to be with working code prototypes that we present about, okay, cool. But at some point, I think we need to sort of like sit down and go, I don't even think this needs to be one protocol, but it needs to be some effort on behalf of this group to coalesce. And I think the best way to do that is with writing, because we can't change the laws of gravity that state that everybody here has assigned work and can't stop what they're doing and say, I will take one for the team and be the implementer of the thing. That would be my attempt to constructively answer your question, Hannah, because I think it's the question of the hour. So let's go Adine and Hannah, who have made their own stack.
Yeah. The zoom feature that's actually useful if you manage to disable the thing, or if you physically pick up your hand and it does it for you. Yeah, I think I agree with most of that. With the caveat that doing the writing without making sure that we have enough people dedicated to like being able to implement the thing leads to like rough stuff. So I feel, for an example, this is like the proposal for like a bitswap 1.3 improvement that basically handles a whole bunch of stuff around like auth and other like random edge cases that have been biting at like the bitswap wire protocol without some of the things that are really annoying, just the things that are really easy to fix, modifying the protobufs, no like new protocol stuff, no like new, stream protocol IDs and whatever. And that was useful. Like it made, I got a bunch of good feedback from various people who were interested parties, but then like sort of push came to shove and I felt like I was helping orchestrate this, but I was like, Kubo, which is the thing I am like, I at the time was able to spend most of my time working on, like doesn't really have a use for this auth thing. But you and you and you and you have all come to me asking for auth. So let me help coordinate the spec work. At which point the thing was like, well, but I mean, if Kubo's not doing it, I don't really want to do it. And that was like, that felt rough. And so I feel like the spec writing helps because it helps us coalesce on ideas, like which things are important for when we get to build. But in order for people to like feel like the time has really gone somewhere, there needs to be some level of commitment to like, if this thing starts to materialize, it will exist inside of some deployed code, at least until we find out that it turns out this whole idea was crazy and we got to shut it down, but like we tried. And that means maybe going to wherever we are and making sure we can earmark some amount of time once the writing is far enough along.
Yeah.
This is just a clarifying question, like, so then this group, it'd sort of be like almost like a TC39 process where we like agree on a spec and the people who are the implementers in various implementations are like, oh yeah, we'll go implement that. Or if they think it's not gonna work, they're like, no, that's a terrible idea and I don't want to do it. Here's why. I just want to make sure I understand the concept.
Yeah, like, so, like, where are we going with all this? and I think Adin's asking the same question.
Yeah.
Right. In my mind, you know, I personally want to back away even from the like, is it going to get implemented? Like, just can we clunch some of these ideas together? Right. Led with like, it needs to support basic block requests. So like, cool, layer that in. This is an escape hatch. It's got to happen. I think Rapide has this wonderful insight that like, hey, we can cram a ton of stuff onto the client side, and that's going to help us a whole bunch. Okay, cool. Can we put that in? Hannah's coming in and saying, guys, HTTP doesn't suck. Like, can we just like can we at least map this onto HTTP semantics? And if it's going to be a request response, why not just use HTTP? Right, like start to see some of these things composed together. I don't know if we actually get to the writing a protocol bit, but like maybe all that exists to do is just to get this group sort of trying to think as a group instead of present as individuals. And I don't know what comes out the other side of it, and I don't want to make any promises. They're like, yeah, we're totally gonna like come up with something great that's super implementable. Who knows? This is research, you know, like maybe it's just a matter of like trying to piece some of these pieces together. And like, we're on the rail. This is the kind of group that can be thoroughly nerd sniped into like, well, that hits something and I want to influence this in a way. So I just like took that and sort of like went a little bit off this way and wrote a prototype. Neat. And then maybe we can pile onto that, right? Like, I don't know. But Lyle, you got a comment in chat. Single, yeah. Lyle, go ahead.
Yeah. I kind of like I kind of like wrote an essay there, but long story short, it's like I agree that specs don't work if you write specs for a single use case or for a single stakeholder. That just leads to frustration. And some prior art there is like spec things work because we have web platform. And if you look how things like what working group or W3C things before that worked, you had multiple stakeholders pulling in different directions, and then you distill to the most useful thing to the majority of stakeholders. No one is happy, but you end up with something that's mostly interoperable, and then you create a compliance test to shame people into obedience implementation-wise. That's my take. And you know, we have web platform tests. We have things like HTML spec and JS spec. And sure, it's never, no one implements 100%, but no one uses 80% of it. So in practice, most people don't even know two browsers diverge in ridiculous places because those are like edge cases low-level engineer will bolt on top of. So I feel focusing on what are the most prevalent use cases for like retrieving data, retrieving content address data today. I have my opinion. I'd say like, well, websites are pretty popular, I've heard. And how website looks like, well, it's a directory with index.html and maybe some things. Every browser sends requests for favicon. You already have like 3 things that you can think, oh, how do I optimize the initial round trip, right? Oh, if I fetch car over HTTP, how would I save literally 2 round trips on every request on every website load that hits cold cache, right? It's not difficult to reason about things if you start from end user instead of low engineering approach, right? Sure, and then like because you will run into your own traps. You have, oh, I have this backend, I have those storage criteria, I need to hit those latency things. You forgot that real people will be using your things. And instead, if you focus on making sure that like the 80% of people will avoid those round trips, sure, it won't be maybe like the most performant thing, but across entire ecosystem, you will save like ton of time, probably energy, and that's. I'd say like first focus on what are the use cases we want to accommodate for, because sure, like let's say you are like storage provider and you won't be serving website requests directly, right? But you will have someone in front of you who will be asked for that index, favicon, whatever, and then that thing in the middle will have to translate that to request to you. Do we need to have like multiple protocols and pay cost of translation layer on every hop? I'd say that's more or less ecosystem-wise question. And I know some people are smiling because that's literally what we are currently trying to solve. So it's pretty fresh on my mind. But I feel it's like the people outside of this group working with content address data hit the same questions, right? So that's like my I think to wrap up, I'd say like think about end user types of requests and how can we like more optimize things end to end to minimize round trips.
Building off of that, I think like just very briefly, I think this is also how we like make IPLD kind of the right amount of IPLD. I feel like we've seen like the kind of pendulum swing back and forth of like, I like blocks, I don't like graphs, or I like links, but I don't like named links, or I don't like other sorts of multi-block data structures. And then you're like, oh, but I need multi-block data structures because like I want to logically represent them as like a big directory or a big map or a big list or something. And you're like, oh, well, how do I do that? And you sort of like go back and forth of like, I want some of this, I want none of this. And I think the areas which hurt the most right now are the ones where you're like, did this really come from an end user request? Probably the one that sticks out the most in IPLD is like floats. Like nobody wanted floats in content address data. Nobody's using floats in content address data. Why are we talking about it in the context of content address data? Right? It just sort of left there on the specs is like, we said floats, but we didn't really mean it because it didn't come from an end user. Right? And so I think that's like, I feel like that's the way that you sort of iterate towards like how do we grow the set of things we can get enough people on board with that we bother implementing it.
Yeah, I think, and Hannah's got a point from chat, like, are we, enumerating experiments might be the wrong direction. Instead of thinking this Lidl getting us centered around this use case. And I would add to that a prioritization of a set of use cases, right? Like, can this group first agree on, hey, if we enumerate concrete, like real world user stories, and I like the emphasis on like fetching a web page, like these like things that don't require deep knowledge of hash link data structures to like actually talk about, because there's some other ones, right? Like getting getting a movie to lots of people fast, right? That's where you now all of a sudden you have like the subgraph, Kraken sync side of things, and that's another use case. How does this group prioritize those against each other's Vision's need for like, hey, we need to deduplicate transmission over the wire as much as possible. We have heard these use cases presented, and I think, Hannah, you're just to try and riff on your comment from chat, like I think an incredible starting before we dive into like academic writing is just enumerating a set of use cases and trying to have a discussion around that in the same way that, Adine, you built this table comparing protocols. Can we build a table that stack ranks use cases? I think that, and we already have a bunch of writing from that. That's the first thing that we asked for at the kickoff of this working group. Hi, why are you here? What do you need? And like, we can go back through those notes and just pull them apart and like start to work through those. But we also, it's been a couple of months. You can probably prioritize some other bits.
Yeah. And also, like, I mean, it would be really helpful to hear in depth from like a couple of folks. I mean, like, I want to hear Dag House just rant for 45 minutes about why we should never use DAGs in our DAG house. Like, so like, like that type of thing I feel like that's what will make us understand like why are you doing it this way? So yeah.
I would sort of counter that a little bit, which is like you cannot make anyone come to the room. So like some of the pinning service API issues stem from the fact that like there weren't enough people in the room, and there were conferences that people went to and they talked about it, and then it came time to write the spec and like not enough people showed up in the room. And so like it doesn't really matter what your use case is if you're not going to show up, because then nobody can make you happy. Only you can make you happy.
I understand, but I mean, like most people, if you say come complain to me about everything I'm doing wrong for like 45 minutes, they will happily take you up on that. I mean, and you don't then have to listen to them, but it's just helpful to understand it, you know. You can be like, that's really stupid. I'm not gonna care. But yeah.
And to put this in a constructive, that's a great idea. Like, Hannah, you're advocating for user studies. We're talking about going and talking to and we're talking about DAG because they serve millions of NFTs. And so of course we should go talk to people and be like, hey, you do a lot of data transfer. Tell us where it hurts, because we're the data transfer better team, and like listening to them and making sure that, to your point, Adine, one of the worst things you can do is compose the design document without that feedback in front of you, right? But ideally we can learn from that mistake here and say, okay, no, it is actually incumbent upon us. Okay, maybe DACA doesn't show up to these calls. That's okay. They watch them. They know about them. We can get them. Hi, Alan. Email inbound. But like, this is possible, right? And so, like, if we, I think this could be done in parallel. I see no reason why we couldn't both simultaneously work on enumerating a set of use cases and try to plunge together some of the existing proposals and see, like, there's no reason that they can't both be happening in parallel, right? And like say, hey, can we get some of these, like, how well can we get some of these things to work together? Putting those things in a conversation makes it really interesting, and where you can actually say, hey, you know, we've all agreed that this use case is the one that needs to be served more, so that should help settle disputes over how something works or doesn't work, or needs to be implemented or doesn't need to be implemented, right? Yeah. Daniel, you had a comment from the chat. Do you want to just read it out for the record? I think it's a good comment.
Yeah, I feel like as someone who hasn't been sort of heavily involved in implementing transfer protocols, but has been with IPFS for long enough to know that there's problems that are established, and there's also very much a culture of experimentation. I think I sense that just coming from the outside, we've sort of spent, as you said, right, this phase of doing research, trying to diverge as much as possible and explore like a breadth of possibilities in improving the protocols, the transfer protocol in IPFS, and maybe coming up with some metrics. I think now is actually a good time for us to converge, because our efforts will only be successful if they're concentrated. Our resources, our time and our attention, I think, as Dean pointed out really nicely in the beginning, are limited. And so I converging is really the only way to move forward. And worse is better, just in the sense of like trying to keep things simple, not trying to invent a request response protocol, trying to, you know, build on something like HTTP. And I mean, even if we look at gateways, which is how most users actually get exposed to IPFS, I have the sense that it's like we've done all of this work in the background to make that more efficient, and then slowly built up more of the IPFS and content addressing functionality to the gateway with, you know, verified responses and whatnot. And so that's becoming more and more of a bottom-up adoption, legitimate path for doing mostly retrieval. Writable gateways might be the sort of, you know, standardized way for ingestion. And then that's also another HTTP interface. And I don't know, I've seen Martin's work on you know, libp2p on top of HTTP, and there seems to be an agreement that HTTP is a good foundation to do a lot of this stuff on. So if we, you know, bring this closer to real world use cases, I'm just very optimistic about this, and that's pretty much it for me.
Yeah. Our team is so sold on Quick that HTTP is like, if Quick is HTTP3, we're in agreement. But the totally semantics aside, this feels like, so this, to me, this feels like a call to action, right? Like, can we actually set a very modest goal of doing something as a group in a 2-week time frame, right? And so, like, we have a meeting in 2 weeks. I don't want to get up here and be like, hey, here's a slide deck. There's nothing in it. And so could we start by saying, hey, we're going to try and take a crack at these 2 documents and see if we can clutch something together and turn this into a little bit more of a working session in 2 weeks, but ideally have something that is meaningfully meaty to actually keep folks believing that, hey, there's something worth showing up for. How do we feel on that? Can I take the temperature of the room? Can we agree that at some point Brendan's going to nudge you in the Move the Bytes working group channel because you were so bold as to join this call and see if you can give input or pile some stuff onto a Notion document? Does that feel like, Hannah, does that feel like it comports with your original question?
You said 2 documents. What are the 2 documents?
Sorry, that should have been.
Yeah.
1, a prioritized set of use cases. So just a table that has use cases. Your invitation is to, very similar to the approach that I think Dean has put forward for the protocol and enumeration side. Can you add, maybe you add a column header and say, hey, I'm going to try and like look at these use cases through this lens, or can you add a use case to that and say like, hey, we're missing this. And then finally, can we as a group in 2 weeks talk about how we would prioritize those? The second document being, can we take the protocols that we've seen presented and research that we've seen elsewhere and start to try and coalesce them into either one thing or a set of things, or just like basically start to smash them all together? I don't even think it needs to like come into like, this is going to be the one protocol that rules them all. Maybe it's just like, this group is trying to write a book report on the things that we've seen to date and try to identify places where we can deduplicate. Those would be the 2 documents. So a protocol design document and a prioritized set of use cases document. And then in 2 weeks, we put them in conversation. That's a thumbs up from Hannah. I've gotten a digital thumbs up from Adine. Lyle, yes. Ryan, yes. Marcus,
How much time?
Yes.
How much time are you hoping for us from us?
I think it's just whatever you have.
Okay.
I will stub out the documents and start to throw in some of these cases based on this conversation. And if you can throw some at it, great. And if you can't, you can't. This is at will, right? Like people are here because they want to be.
Yeah.
And so
all of
idea
the all the protocol labs people on this call are now involved in a nuts project that is super high speed deploy. Actually, sorry, Marco's not.
So
I don't know
will,
Chiropo has brought into it yet, but
yeah, Brennan, there will probably be a soon IPFS implementer sync once we can get our ducks in a row, which we're trying. Some things around cars and gateways and stuff to basically be like, hey, what if you wanted like something more practical? What if you wanted something a little more precise than like, you know, a block or an everything? Because
like a range of blocks.
Yeah, or like perhaps enough to like load a website. Right.
The actual
This doesn't seem vague at all.
or like a range request or like whatever. Like, I mean, but this is part of the everyone hates every graph description syntax business. So like, we'll put that up. We'll see what people think. We have another one of these, which is everyone seems to like cars and likes HTTP and neglects the fact that you cannot in fact send a car over HTTP in a streaming fashion and know that it completed successfully. This seems to be like one of the things that got missed in the loving cars and loving HTTP. So we may have to like deal with that thing. And so those will probably be 2 to IPIP things that emerge for some level of feedback. But it's part of this. I mean, it's part of this business, though, right? Gateways are sort of one thing where we know we can like put up an IPIP, and there are multiple stakeholders involved in building and running gateways that you can see if people throw tomatoes at you and this is a bad idea and don't do it, right? Or at least don't do it as a, it's not like you can say you're doing it, but no, I don't want this thing as part of the spec that is going to be cross-group implemented, right? Right, that's at least one area where we know we have some level of buy-in from multiple parties on like, this thing should probably exist. IPFS:// should probably have sane behavior across across environments. Right. I think that's part of the reason why people want to do are like some of like the HTTP and the gateway stuff is because like they know which bucket to put it in. It's like if you didn't feel like making like an 800th repo, but you didn't know where to put your miscellaneous project, and you're like, yeah, I'll just leave it on my desktop because I don't know where to put this thing. You know, so there's like the gateways are like a place people can see where they know there's a way to like talk about and get some level of convergence.
Okay, so we have an allusion to a thing that's coming and a metaphor based on that thing.
Yeah,
Jerome, what's going on?
Sorry, I don't want to send partial things to distract everybody. Rather send something that
or interrupt this stream mid-flight. Yeah, okay. Dropo, what's up?
No, I was about to say more or less a more precise description of what he was speaking about, but we have the meeting next week and it's going to be good enough. Keeps the suspense until then.
Cool. So that's the IPFS implementers working group call. That is another call that it happens. Cool. All right. So I'm going to take a stab at these two documents. I'm going to set them up. I'm going to post them in the channel. And I would love it if folks could try and throw some stuff on there. Sounds like there's a use case brewing. Let's get it enumerated and stick it to the top of the list and fight about whether it should be at the top of the list. It's about as far as the impact of this conversation affects this group's agenda as far as I'm concerned. But like, maybe this is a great moment to augment an in-flight engineering effort with a couple of small graceful touches in a way that may make it more generally applicable. I don't know. We will have to wait in deep suspense for whatever is going on here. But cool. Anybody have any closing thoughts? Going once, going twice. Okay, my closing thought. I'm excited. I think assigning a little bit of group work to this group is the right way to go, and we'll see if we can't actually go, hey, these are all the cool things these people have done in parallel, and now actually have a conversation about doing something in series. That metaphor kind of fell apart midway. Anyway, cool. Thank you everybody for your time. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to chatting in 2 weeks with some type of lovely document to consider. But thanks again. See y'all.